So I was putting a lot of emphasis on languages, and you may have been wondering why. And part of the reason why is because languages is often a pretty good stand-in for cultures. And what I mean by that is if two groups are distinct enough to have developed entirely distinctive ways of speaking, it's a reasonable assumption that they also are distinct enough to have developed at least some differences in terms of how they think about who's related to who, in terms of how they think about spiritual entities, in terms of their histories. And much like language, cultures may be very, very similar to each other and have a lot in common, such as several of the Athabascan groups, but there's still enough distinctiveness that we think of these as two different cultures. And we can think of specific cultures, or as that example shows, larger culture groups. And so within Athabascan, you have 11 different groups, Dena'ina, Atna, Halikachuk, for example, but then you could think of that as part of a bigger cultural tradition we call Athabascan, a larger cultural group. In much the same way that we sometimes talk about Western European, but then can also speak about British, Irish, German, French, and even get more specific than that. So these are sort of some major culture regions or culture groups in our area. Different authors will divide this up slightly different. This author specifically has 6. Your Williams book suggests 8. I think I side more with Williams. This map sides with the 6 model. So you have Athabascan all across the interior of Alaska, Yupik, Siberian Yupik, which this map doesn't show, so actually this should be 7, because the island where Siberian Yupik people live would be its own cultural group. I think pretty much everyone agrees on that. Lutik, Aleut, Southeast region. Southeast region is kind of fascinating because Tlingit, Tsimshian, Haida are very different from each other in a lot of different ways that we'll talk about when we get to that part of the class. However, there's enough in common in terms of artistic traditions, how villages are set up. There's enough in common that we group these together, even though they're, for example, entirely very separate languages from each other. And so these are sort of, and you have, of course, the Inupiaq region, which is part of the much bigger Inuit region that extends all the way into Canada and Greenland. So these are kind of our major cultural groups. Eyak is oftentimes treated as its own culture group as well, which would make sense for a lot of different reasons. So when people say things like, oh, I want to learn about Alaska Native culture, singular culture without the S, one, I'm always really excited. Like, I love your energy. That's freaking awesome. We're going to have a great semester. But then the other thing I always kind of want to emphasize with people, the other point I try to emphasize, though, with people as we go along in this class is there's not really one singular Alaska Native culture. As your Roderick book suggests, there are some cultural values, such as respect for elders, which do seem to hold true across all of these different groups. But they're as a value. But beyond these sort of broad similarities, there's so much local diversity, right? At the very least, these 8 very different cultural regions that have very different ways of speaking, very different ways of thinking about relatedness, very different ways of making a living. So that's going to kind of structure the second unit of our class. We're going to talk about Athabascan groups in 1 week, and we're going to talk about Inupiaq groups in 1 week. And even beyond that, of course, you want to think about the fact that for Inupiaq region, this huge territory that we've got up here in yellow, each tribe or each local group, each village within that would, of course, have their own sort of local uniqueness. And so remembering that as well. Which is one of the reasons why people will very often self-identify not just as the specific language, but as the specific village that they're from. One of many reasons why people might do that. This is a painting called Ceremonial Dress, done by a European artist, but from 1827, and was designed to kind of show diversity in terms of forms of dress between Unagash, Shukpiaq, and Tlingit people. Where was I going with this? Oh, I just share a few examples to show some of that diversity, of cultural diversity, so you know I'm not just sort of making it up, but that it really is true that these groups can have a lot of distinctiveness in terms of cultural traditions. One of them is Dena'ina, people who, of course, thrived in the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet, partly based on a cultural tradition that leaned heavily into making a living based on salmon, as well as other marine creatures. Even though, so speaking an Athabascan language, but unlike the other Athabascan groups, well, unlike some of the other Athabascan groups, a much more coastal group, and therefore a language and a legacy that reflects that. And, their unique collection of suktu, traditional stories, some of which were written up by the elder Peter Kalifornsky, distinctive ways of fishing, such as this way of using halibut fishing, where the tide would come in and you'd have this halibut or this fish like hanging from a thread. So then, fish comes up and grabs it and then pulls out, and you've got yourself a fish. So anyways, just distinctive ways of doing things, which is of course different than Shukpiak, people living on Kodiak Island and the other side of the other side of Kenai Peninsula, speaking a totally different, not just language, but language family, having totally different ways of dress, and relying even more heavily on sort of ocean resources. And then that in turn is different, has similarities too, but is also different from Aleut people, or Unangan, depending on if we're talking singular or plural. This is a quote from Ilarion or Larry Merkuliev, who we'll read later in the semester, talking about the incredibly culturally specific ways of navigating because of living on the Aleutian Islands, where there was heavy fogs and you could often not see the stars. So people that had to learn how to navigate using the waves and using which birds you were seeing and which seals you were seeing, so you could get a sense of where you were in relation to other islands. So very much a seafaring kind of traditional culture. And again, forms of dress such as this hat, which are very different than what we saw traditionally with Dena'ina people. And then Yupik and Cupid cultures. This is a quote from Joan Picarilla Hamilton that we'll talk about later in the course, where she's talking about sort of how Yupik education was thought of, and a very distinctively sort of Yupik set of values about how education is done, and specific way of living in sort of that more as tundra type environment, which is of course different still from Inupiaq or Inuit lifeways, adapting to the far north Arctic tundra. And of course, even within that, Inuit people speaking two different branches of that Inupiaq, depending on which side of this red line you're on. And of course, nowadays, having their communities heavily influenced by and being intertwined with the oil politics of our state, which is something that really isn't true for some of the other southern groups to the same degree at all. And so very different histories also under colonialism and under modernity and under globalization in terms of how things have gone economically. And people, for example, out here, where local villages depend a lot more on things like tourism or different things than up here where a lot has to do with the oil industry. And so differences abound, right? Even as I said before with Athabascan groups, we could even look within that and say, well, even within that, there's 11 different Athabascan languages, each with their own cultural traditions, such as Gwich'in traditions having to do with caribou, stories having to do with caribous, different ways of clothing that were, and homes, some of which were shared by other Athabascan groups and some of which were distinctively Gwich'in. And of course, the Gwich'in having been particularly impacted or involved in the ongoing discussions of whether or not there should be oil drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, because that's where the porcupine herd goes through, is that specific area for calving. And so all of these examples just show us diversity over and over again, that Alaska Native is not one thing. We use that term, it's an important term, it's a valuable term, and certainly in modern times, Alaska Native people have often banded together to push for civil rights, to push for economic recognition, to push for the rights of Alaska Native corporations, or the formation of those corporations to begin with. Nonetheless, please understand that ultimately, these are distinctive communities, and to keep an eye towards that diversity. So if you thought, oh, this is really simple, we'll learn all about Alaska Native culture, singular, turns out it's a lot more complicated. But I think that also turns out that it's a lot more beautiful and complex and wonderful, because instead of studying just one way of life, we're studying at least 20 different ways of life, 20 different ways of how to be a human, 20 different ways of how to make meaning in this universe, 20 different ways of how to live in these diverse lands of Alaska. Our lives are not all the same. Our cultures are not all the same. We are richer for it. So understanding that diversity is an important part of the bird's eye view of Alaska.